So thanks very much for having me here today. My name's Blaithin Lally. Charlotte Wilson is not here with me, just all by myself, here in spirit though. So this was a study I did as part of my clinical doctorate in psychology at Trinity College. So Charlotte Wilson was the supervisor of the project, and Dr. Lee McGowan was also involved. He was the academic advisor to this piece of research. It's just to acknowledge the input from both of them. So the study that I did involved interviewing mothers of adults with mental health difficulties, and these mothers were a member of a particular mental health group. But just to give a little bit of background to my study. So in recent decades, there's been quite a shift in our conceptualization of mental health and mental health treatment and living with mental health difficulties. So there's been a move from institutionalization to more community-based services, and also a move from, well, some shifting in ideas around purely biomedical model approach to mental health to maybe a more recovery-focused and multidimensional, multidisciplinary approach within community settings. And this has increased the role of responsibility and the dependence on the individual themselves who has a mental health difficulty, but also for their family members and the roles that they have in terms of their loved one's recovery journey. Family carers of individuals with mental health difficulties, they are self-identifying as a growing body, a growing population. We know from looking at census data internationally that the numbers are increasing year on year. The kind of time spent in this kind of role is, so internationally they're saying about approximately 15 years on average for maybe 22 hours a week. But when we look at the data that's more local in Irish studies, people tend to say it's for a longer period of time and for a greater number of hours per week. And when we look at the breakdown of who these family carers are, there's a larger proportion who would be parents of a child with mental health difficulties. So we know that caring for someone can be an emotionally and psychologically and a very physically demanding role. And there can be objective burdens like financial impact and impact on their daily tasks and the amount of energy that they have to give and their own health and their own mental health. And then subjective burdens around their perception of the burden that they're experiencing in this role, and impacts on their own social life, impacts on their own emotional well-being. And a lot of what will come out of the research on family carers is a lot of worry that they feel in terms of what the future holds, worry for themselves, worry for their loved one, experiences of loss and grief in terms of the expected future they'd had for their loved one, and also the relationship that they would have had with their loved one. Experiences of uncertainty, what's coming next, when will their loved one become very unwell again, what's coming, and experiences of shame and stigma in society, their own feelings of guilt and responsibility and self-blame in terms of the onset of the mental health difficulties, but also anything that they might be doing that might be maintaining those difficulties as well. And they've expressed a lot of anger and resentment and feelings of being overwhelmed, directed at themselves, directed at their loved one, but also directed at services and professionals and society as a whole. And they'd often talk about feeling consumed by the role, which is a theme that came up in a project earlier as well. And in terms of services and professionals, they've talked about, while there can be a support and a source of information, they can often be quite burdensome as well in terms of their expectations of what kind of a role families will take on. And also people have described feeling spoken down to, that services can be condescending, that services can hold these expectations and expect them to take on a lot more than maybe they're actually able to do. And then there's other dimensions of caring as well. So many people have talked about feeling an improved relationship with their loved one and feeling that they've developed more coping skills, become more resilient, and have found a purpose. And there's an opportunity for growth in that, for development and learning about mental health, about good mental health, about different paths, about relationships, about family relating, and about their own coping skills and ways of coping and managing. And that this role is facilitated by positive attitudes, but also by feelings of love and feelings of patience, which came out in some of the earlier research discussed today as well. And so a lot of carers they have a tendency to put the needs of their loved one ahead of their own needs. And they've talked about it being such a consuming role. But many of them are occupying dual roles. So they're not just a carer, they're a father and a carer, or they're a husband or a wife and a carer, or they're a sibling and a carer. And I focused on mothers. So mothers tend to spend most time in the caring role. They tend to have, and this internationally and in Ireland, they tend to have the most contact with services, and they tend to be the most likely to engage with certain supports, particularly support groups. And we also have cultural representations around what a good mother involves. And that tends to be someone who is self-sacrificing, protecting their vulnerable children, devoting their time and their energy, devoting their resources to the needs of their child, which isn't terribly unlike some of the expectations that are placed on carers as well. So given this burden and the pressures and external pressures, what is it that families find helps? And they've identified feeling included in the process rather than feeling excluded by services, and information. Information is so key, and education, counselling and therapy. But support groups will come up again and again, that they can be a source of that information that can be so difficult to find. A place where they can share, where they can openly discuss their experience, find support from one another, and a platform to other services and supports and information. And that within those groups, the best benefits seem to come from not just receiving support, but giving support in those situations as well. So the group that I was really interested in was a group called Trialogue, and a mental health trialogue. It brings together professionals in mental health, service users themselves, but also the families and carers who are involved. And it puts them together on an even speaking playing field, so that their backgrounds in terms of whether you're an expert by training or an expert by your lived experience, that those are all held with equal respect and equal value. They're all recognised as extremely valid. So there's equal weight given to each of the voices. And the aims of these meetings that are facilitated by service users, carers and professionals, and organised, and often the groups are started by all three, their aim is to try and develop an understanding of mental health and to have an impact on community perceptions of mental health, and transform thinking around developing better services, and what do better services and what does a better treatment and recovery and living with mental health look like. So I interviewed 8 mothers from across Trialogue groups across Ireland, and they're pretty in-depth interviews, about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And each of these mums had an adult child with mental health difficulties. And the kind of difficulties their children had were tended to be mood difficulties, suicidality, and then related to psychosis. And they would have, so the most recent onset of mental health difficulties would have been 1 year, but some of them, they're living with their child who would have had difficulties for more than 10 years. And the framework in collecting my data and analysing my data was an interpretive phenomenological analysis approach. So that involved getting their understanding and the meaning that they've made of their personal experiences, and then my interpretations of their interpretations, okay? So there's a double hermeneutic involved here. That's a little bit complicated, but good supervision managed to work it out. And so from that analysis, this is the overall findings. So I'm just going to talk about some of the key ones within that. So in terms of how they derived meaning and made sense of their experience within trialogue. So you can see at the top there is seeking an in-group. It was so important to these women that they had found other people who had had similar experiences to them. So it reduced that sense of isolation that they can feel. So many of them would have talked about feeling as though this has never happened to anyone else. I'm the only one who's in this boat. And then meeting those other people with that shared experience, that commonality, that universality. But also in this group, meeting other people who had some kind of shared attitude. So they tended to want to focus more on recovery rather than diagnosis. So attitudes and beliefs around mental health like that. So they were sort of getting validation from each other within that. And within the group then, there were particular conditions. So I imagined it as sort of like the temperature of the water in the pool had to be just right for everyone to go swimming, okay? And for what the right temperature looked like was there had to be confidentiality, there had to be respect within the group for each other, people had to feel like their voice was being held equal, that, just because someone had expertise as a result of professional training didn't mean they had any more respect or less respect than someone who had garnered their experience or their expertise from their personal experiences. And really important to that was there being balance within the group. So for some of the mothers, the groups were quite well balanced and they felt they had a cohort within their group and that their voice was really being heard and really being listened to and that they could say what they needed to say. Whereas for some mothers, their group maybe didn't have quite the balance in terms of numbers in the group and they found themselves almost feeling more silenced as a result of that, maybe monitoring a little bit more what they were saying within the group, worrying how might it be taken. And so it really, this was so important to them to know that they could say what needed to be said, that they weren't feeling further silenced by being within this group. And then the kind of activities that they could engage in within the right temperature pool was sharing their story, hearing the stories of others, feeling that their experiences and their emotional responses were being validated by others, getting to validate the experience of others, giving and receiving that support, the information sharing, which is so key, and accessing different perspectives. So they were getting to hear about the different experiences that other caregivers were having, but they were also getting to hear around similar situations. What was that like for the person with the mental health difficulties? How did they experience that same type of scenario? And also, what's that like for the professional? How are they viewing it? How are they experiencing it? Is there some kind of shared understanding that we can all come to around what could be potentially very, very delicate topics? And then the final piece within that was their own personal journey. Anger did play quite a big part for all the mothers, but in particular at the beginning of their entry into the trialogue groups. And it was, again, that sharing it, hearing the anger of others and their experiences, and then feeling as though it was being validated, it was being processed, and then they sort of moved on from that. They were able to let some of that go. A lot of them talked about maybe a personal growth that they experienced, and in that getting to hear the different perspectives that widened their own perspective, and how that was impacting on their own behaviours and their relationship with their child. So for some of them, their child was in the same trialogue group, and they were hearing how they spoke and hearing their child's experiences echoed around the room by other service users, and starting to think a little bit differently about it, or starting to interact a little bit differently. And then taking on new roles. Some of them had gone on to become facilitators within the group. Some of them had met with other people within the group who saw a need for some kind of a service or information posting within their local area and took on that project as an aside. But what was interesting was it was always viewed as Trialogue remained static in its purpose, and it was sort of there, and then they kind of stepped into various roles inside or outside of it, but they always knew they could go back and it would remain pretty much the same experience for them. So this is just some of their quotes. So you really feel like you're not in isolation. A certain amount of bonding happens because of the commonality. And Trialogue is breaking down them barriers and opening up people's minds to recovery. It was mind-blowing that in this room we had service users, professionals and family members all talking about the same thing in a very non-threatening way. And looking back, I think I was quite narrow-minded in the way I thought about things. I certainly would hope I'd be much more broad-minded now, more open to things. So the second superordinate theme that came out was navigating trauma, relationships and roles. So for each of the mothers, the onset of their child's mental health difficulties is very much seen as a trauma that they experienced as well. They gave really, really accurate and detailed descriptions of experiences seeing their child suffering, like suicide attempts, like psychotic episodes. It impacted on them really, really significantly. But then in terms of how they interpreted the mother role, the carer role, or the two of those roles together, they all tended to view it in quite different ways. So for some, motherhood was a very natural part of who they were and who they saw themselves as being and becoming, and it came naturally to them. For others, they saw it as something they really had to work on, that it was really quite difficult for them, and it wasn't something they naturally had in them, but that came about as a result of experience. And then in terms of the carer role, there were very different interpretations of what being a carer meant or how they identified with that role. For some of them, some of the duties you might associate with the carer role were very much what they had expected of motherhood. So they saw it as a natural part of what they would already have been doing, maybe an extension of it. Some of them saw that, well, I'm a natural carer anyway, I was always going to be very involved, I was always going to be doing these things, whether I was a mother or related to a person or not, this was a part of who I was. And then for others, they totally rejected the label of carer. So one mother talks about her daughter saying to her, I don't need a carer, you're my mom, I just need you to be my mom. And she agreed with her, yeah, I'm not your carer, I'm your mother. And then for others, this was a very unexpected role for them to take on duties of a carer, a role of a carer. That it interrupted what they had expected for their child's future, but also what they had expected for their own future. So there was kind of a difference in how tightly the mothers held on to each of those ideas, and some totally rejected an idea, and others were able to move maybe more easily between the two at certain times, and then others, it was that consuming role for them that had taken over. They talked about having to renegotiate their bond and their relationship with their child, so having to move between at times separating out a mental illness from who their child was, at times having to separate and join with a service, and it almost felt as though it was against their child, but for their child's care. At other times they were joining together with their child against mental health services, against the mental health symptoms. And then in terms of their own development, for all the mothers, the onset of mental health difficulties was very much an interruption in their own developmental path. And then when it came to what happened after, this is where they started to differ a bit. So some of them felt really trapped in that consuming care role, and they felt they were almost put on this path and they had no choices around it. Others were trying to get back to something back here, who they were before, and that seemed to feel very inauthentic to them. It was like they were trying to put on a mask and it wasn't really who they were, and that may have been impacted by the experiences that they now had, and the passage of time anyway, that maybe this wouldn't be who they are now. And then others were their own path builders, so they took on new roles. They took on a warrior mother role, that they were going to fight for their children no matter what. And then for many of them, that role extended into an activist role, that there are people out there, not just my child, who are suffering and need someone to fight on behalf of them. So this is a few of the quotes there. Rebecca says, "I think I've grown to be who I was meant to be." And Sarah there says, her daughter told her, "But I don't need any care, you're my mum, I just want you to be my mum." And I said, "Yeah, I am your mum." And then Miriam at the top there is talking about an experience of finding her son having attempted suicide. "I do believe that something died inside me that day I'll never get over. I never got back from that day." And then she also says about it, "But something woke up for me. It was the primal instinct of a mother." And then the final overarching theme was around the dynamics of power. So they all talked about experiences of feeling as though power had been taken away from them in some way, and then also ways that they had claimed back that power. And so they talked about, and those experiences sort of fell into these three areas of, in terms of the services, in terms of society, and in terms of the mental illness itself. So they talked about in services how the system can feel burdensome and they can feel so powerless within it, how they felt quite excluded in terms of the care of their child because their child was an adult. And the diagnostic labels, the medications, the treatments that they were informed of or options that they were given, the lack of support, and then experience of professionals talking down to them, acting in some way superior to them, that was their experience of it, that all of this pulled power away from them, left them feeling powerless. And then things that helped to re-empower them was seeking out education, seeking out knowledge, taking on more activist roles to fight some of those disempowering factors. And then they would have all mentioned trialogue, that this was a space where they could reclaim some of that power and feel they had some kind of influence in terms of hearing from the professionals and the service users and expressing their experience as well. Within society, they talked about the stigma associated with mental health, the language that gets used around it, and the media, and then the silence that is often around it. And they all mentioned Brezzy, and they all thought he was very attractive. But celebrities coming out and speaking more about their personal experiences and how there was so much benefit in that, and it was changing society's perceptions, but they also really had an awareness of not all diagnostic labels are created equally. So it might be okay to talk about your experience of having depression or anxiety, but there really was no one coming out and talking about their experience of being labelled with schizophrenia, not within their realm that they were hearing about. So they felt there's still negative representations in the media around those kinds of less favourably looked upon mental health difficulties. And then what helped to re-empower them was talking, being open, seeking out education and information again, that's so important. The language that they used, the positive aspects and ways you can harness the media, like the Little Things campaign and like those celebrities coming out with their experiences, and then getting involved in activism to try and change things. And of course, trialogue came up for them as well. And then the mental illness itself, so those symptoms that were so unpredictable, seeing their child suffering and not knowing how to help them or what they can do to help them, their lack of knowledge, their lack of experience, and the possible role of responsibility that they're having in it. That was all so disempowering to them. And what helped them in reclaiming power was education and knowledge, experience, and being able to support others. So having information, being able to share that information, having a sense of what works and being able to share that with others, that felt very empowering to these women. And of course, trialogue came into that as well. So this is some of the quotes around that. So Miriam there says, "I'm equal to them." This is in relation to the professionals, mental health professionals. And I'd said many times, "I'm actually not your patient doctor, I'm actually a mother. You're a mother, so I'm asking you as a mother. you know, obviously I want your professional view, but I'm asking you as a mother, remember that's my son you're talking about. And they just don't talk down to you as much if you have a bit of knowledge and can challenge their beliefs. And then at the bottom here, my way was education. My coping skills were education. So if I was going to try and pull out some of the key learnings from the research and what those mothers want us to know from what they've shared, they want to be recognised as a group. They want to feel in some way included, and they want to feel empowered, and they want to feel respected and heard. I think it's really interesting how differently they interpreted their roles in terms of motherhood and in terms of caring. And you know, maybe as professionals we can assume someone has a particular role and identity, and we might need to be more careful about that, and how we can think about how we can better support around that. Information was so key in terms of feeling they'd reclaimed power and feeling they had some better understanding and a better, stronger position. And as has come up repeatedly today, it was so difficult for them to get. And support groups, trialogue, they can be really good access points in terms of getting that information and knowledge, but clearly as an overall service initiative, we need to be doing better in providing information to people. And in terms of trialogue then, they were selling it for me anyway, that this was a place where they were getting to hear all these different voices and getting to share their voice, but they really highlighted the importance of within that it has to have the right water temperature. There needs to be that balance in the group. So they would very much be encouraging any family carers who are out there to find your local trialogue group and get involved and try and make some positive changes in terms of mental health. Okay, so just to finish on some quotes from them. I am the warrior, and I will fight to the last breath for my children. I will do anything that it takes to look after my children. So yes, I've got strength, I've got the voice, I have shared and I have listened, and I've probably shared the tears as well. My tears and other people's tears. We've shared the tears. So thanks very much.